All right. Hello, everybody. Happy Wednesday. So this is the asynchronous lecture for the week of February 3rd. Now, we're going to be continuing to looking at studying and measuring the effects of popular culture. So for those of you that are in communications, this is essentially a media effects kind of session. And what we're doing is we're focusing down in particular on popular culture as a form of media. So if you're coming from communications and you've looked at media effects before, that's great. This is something similar in a different field of study or a subfield of study. And if you're coming from outside of communications, don't panic. You're going to be on the same footing. But essentially what we're talking about is media effects. What we'll be doing in this recorded video is looking at the CSI effect in particular. So just a reminder of where we left off from our last recorded class. Now, our live class on Wednesday featured Cassidy talking about writing a research proposal assignment. And we're going to come back to the research proposal again when we start to analyze the third reading for today's class. But before we talked in depth about the research proposal, we looked at the Pop Justice article, which examined the impact of popular culture on social change, and in particular, whether or not popular culture can be a tool for shaping social change. So some takeaways from the Pop Justice article. It's a good example of several of the elements from your midterms or your research proposals that you'll be working on, as well as the final exams or the completed research project. It has many of the same sections that you'll be asked to do for the final, and some of the same sections that you're asked to look at for the research proposal as well. So the introduction, the literature review, that's for the final. You're doing an annotated bibliography, as Cassidy mentioned. For the research proposal, the methodology section is found in both projects. The Pop Justice article is also a really good starting point for picking your methodology. So if you've never done research methods before, there was a great table in the Pop Justice article, and you can cite this as one of your sources for the methods section, but you will need to dig up other resources as well. But there was a great table that laid out some, but not all, of the research methods that are used, generally speaking, not just in popular culture or communications, but there was also kind of like a pros and cons list or a benefits and limitations list in that table for each methodology. So that should help you to narrow down what kind of method you should be using for your project. Now, in addition, the Pop Justice article also showed us that popular culture does have the ability to influence perceptions. So the authors started from the premise that popular culture has been shown to perpetuate negative stereotypes of different identity groups. And in particular, these authors were interested in visible minorities and immigrants and people of color in the context of the United States. But they were found that pop culture can influence how people treat individuals and groups that meet those definitions. And they were like, okay, if pop culture can be used negatively to shape perceptions about these groups, can it be used positively? And by positively, the authors meant as an agent for social change. So they defined social change early on in their paper. That's a new key concept that we've added to our popular culture vocabulary. And I would encourage you to go back to that definition, especially if it's relevant for your research project. It could be a helpful starting point. The authors also presented a different definition of popular culture. So if that is a definition that you align with more than some of the other ones that we've looked at together this semester, that could be a definition that you use in your projects as well, if it's relevant to do so. The authors considered how and why popular culture can be an agent for social change. So it's most effective when the characters or the story presented is likable, when it's believable, and when there is some kind of narrative piece to it. And so coming back to what I was saying earlier about how this is kind of like a media effects, mass media, as you know, includes fiction and nonfiction, and certainly there is narrative or storytelling elements in both fiction and nonfiction. But usually when we talk about popular culture, usually, but not always, we're talking about something fictitious. So something that incorporates some kind of storytelling. And that is when pop culture is the most effective. It makes the stories that are being told relatable, informative, and entertaining all at the same time. And so that brings us to today's class on the concept of the CSI effect. Now, for today's class, you were asked to look at 3 different research papers that examined the CSI effect. These papers used different methodologies. They also spanned over 20 years, give or take, 15 to 20 years together. So the 2006 article by Schweitzer and Sachs used an experiment or an experimental design. 10 years later, Shantz and Sulfati used a systematic review of the literature and a meta-analysis. Now, a meta-analysis is a statistical analysis that combines the results of multiple scientific studies. It can be performed or used when there are multiple studies that address the same question, with each individual study reporting measurements that are expected to have some degree of error. And so what a meta-analysis does is it tries to bring all of this data together, all of these numbers together, and get a better understanding of how they fit to confirm how they fit together. The last article, the 2020 article by Clients, Winters, and Chapman, used multiple methods. So it used surveys of the individual participants and also a content analysis of the deliberations that occurred in their experiment. So we're going to be looking at all 3 studies. You'll want to have the third reading, the most recent article, Clients, Winter, and Chapman, close at hand, or you may want to take some notes and go back and refer to it because we're going to be dissecting that one together. And the reason that we're going to do that is it's going to help you prepare your annotated bibliographies, which Cassidy spoke about in detail in the live class on Wednesday night. So before we get there, let's start with the oldest reading, Schweitzer and Sachs, because newer research builds on older research. And you'll notice that the 2020 article actually cited or referred to this 2006 piece. So Schweitzer and Sachs put together 2 hypotheses. And they also defined what the CSI effect was. So they found that the CSI effect, which refers to this theory that CSI, which is short for crime scene investigation, and its many spin-offs affect the public and trials. And it does this through the glorification and wild exaggeration of forensic science evidence. So when they were researching their article, Schweitzer and Sachs found that it was suspected or believed that the CSI effect burdens the prosecution. So the lawyers that are responsible for once a criminal has been charged with the crime, for convicting them of that crime by creating great expectations about forensic science that can't always be delivered. Prosecution or prosecutors feel that because of CSI, juries expect flashy, fancy, high-tech forensic evidence. And when there isn't enough evidence at trial, or when that evidence is not as impressive as you see on television, it's believed, or at least felt by prosecutors, that juries are more likely to acquit someone who's on trial. So when acquittal is when you're found to be not guilty of something. The other lawyers in a criminal case, the defense, so the lawyers that are responsible for saying and proving that their client, the defendant, or the person that's charged with the crime has not committed that crime, also say that the CSI effect impacts them. They say it does this because CSI and all of its spin-offs create an exaggerated faith in the capabilities and reliability of forensic science. Defense attorneys also find that in television, the outcome is often in favor of the prosecution. So at the end of most CSI episodes and shows like CSI, the prosecutor, the police, they often get their man at the end of the episode. And because this happens, it suggests that forensic science evidence is very effective and very accurate, thereby suggesting that jurors are more likely to accept the conclusions of forensic science. And this is even though more recent studies have found that forensic science errors and DNA errors are among the leading causes of false convictions. So what's happening in real life is different than what's happening on television, which is moving in the opposite direction. And that's what the second slide goes on to explain in more detail. How does the CSI effect work? Let's take a look. Okay, let's try this again. How does the CSI effect work?
Look at the blood spatter.
Bang, bang, bang. My name is Matthew Steiner.
Matt Steiner is a senior crime scene analyst and veteran investigator of over 21 years.
Today we're going to break down the portrayal of forensic science in TV and movies. As we're critiquing these clips, understand that their goal is to entertain, and they definitely do that. The Wire trajectory analysis. First off, the gun safety in this was it was comical and not realistic. You wouldn't take a loaded weapon and start waving it around at a crime scene. Initially, the original crime scene investigator on the scene should have took note of directionality.
Motherfucker.
We do that by looking at the conchoidal fracturing of glass to see which direction the force is going.
Oh, fuck. Oh, fuck.
So we would have known in this case originally that the bullet was coming from outside to the inside of the kitchen. So what they do from that point is they try to figure what would the trajectory line be from that bullet hole through a deceased body. Which way was that bullet going?
Fucking A.
Lo and behold, there is the bullet in the door.
Motherfucker.
From that point, I think we deviate from reality. We wouldn't just start picking at that hole. They could be destroying rifling that's on that bullet. And that's what really we're going to send to the lab to do some sort of analysis compared to the suspect's gun.
Motherfucker.
NCIS, personal protective equipment.
No, rule number 2 is always wear gloves, but when there's this much blood.
Rain gear. In the truck.
So in this scene, they actually talk about wearing personal protective equipment.
Rain gear.
Yet no one is wearing any sort of garb.
What happened?
Everyone is wearing just like a jumpsuit or their regular attire and just gloves. Basically, you would never want to do that.
Well, apparently that one did.
Beyond that, our crime scene technician, he's taking photographs. He then wipes his brow. Then he handles evidence. Basically what he's done, he's taken DNA that was on that camera, on his brow, and put it onto our evidence on the scene. And then proceeds to have a whole conversation while holding that evidence right by his face.
Did you see The Counselor? That was a pretty good movie.
Again, improper procedure for collection of DNA evidence. He could have been wearing a Tyvek suit, a mask. You may even want to wear goggles or glasses and multiple layers of gloves.
Rule number 2 is always wear gloves.
I would strip out the outer layer of glove, put another layer of gloves on top of it, and then proceed to collect evidence.
I think I found that out, boss.
We recovering evidence, Zodiac.
Okay, looks like you wiped the cab down pretty good. We got some blood over here. Prints? Could very well be.
Initial observations is that the vehicle might have been wiped down, which you can see sometimes with oblique lighting on a scene. You can see sometimes fingerprints. So that's a pretty good observation.
Thank you.
As we proceed to the other side of the vehicle, there's a shell casing on the driver's side front floor, which wasn't marked or photographed as far as I could tell.
Oh, well, that's good.
If things got to be documented in situ or as is, as found, he just picks it up with a pen. Where has that pen been beforehand? You know, was it in your hand? Was it in your ear? Was it in your nose?
Right here.
You know, it's got DNA from who knows where. I don't know where this started. Unfortunately, I've seen this in real life. If anything, if this is like a PSA of what not to do at a crime scene, that's one of those big things you wouldn't want to do at a crime scene.
I'm an idiot.
Tire impression evidence, the flash.
Getaway cars, a Mustang Shelby GT500. Shelbys have a rear super wide tire specific to that model, 12 inches with an asymmetrical tread.
I don't think anyone, just by looking at a tire impression to say it came from a specific vehicle.
Sorry.
We would do some sort of dental stone casting of that impression, recover it, send it to the lab. And then there's a database which they can search to say what sort of vehicles it could come from.
There's something else.
Thanks. And there's a pen again being used to collect evidence,
My dad gave me that pen
which is improper.
before he died.
Another thing you wouldn't do is if anything is inside of our impression at our scene, we would leave it there. We would cast it in place. We wouldn't sample it because you could be destroying treadwear inside that impression.
Yeah, I did.
After he samples with the pen,
Fecal excrement. Animal, I'd guess.
I don't know how he would know the difference between human and animal feces, which I don't think is realistic.
No.
All right, so this video goes on for a full 20 minutes, and the person that you're seeing in the video critiques not only CSI, but several CSI-like programs to show some of the errors or inaccuracies that are depicted on television. And if that's something that you're interested in, there's a whole series of that with regards to different types of television programs as well. But that brings us to the question, are the techniques shown on television in CSI and CSI-like programs exaggerated? And Schweitzer and Sachs, the authors of the first article that you were asked to read, say they are. They found existing studies which estimate that 40% of the so-called science that's used on these programs does not exist. And the stuff that does exist is carried out way differently than it is in real life. And we saw that in the video that we just watched together, where a real life analyst was breaking down some of the things that happen on television. Generally speaking, what happens in a television program like CSI is faster, better, flashier, more high tech, and often more exciting than what happens in real life. And there is also a reasonable explanation for that. Programs like CSI or a movie like the Zodiac movie only has the attention of its audience for a finite amount of time. So CSI and television programs usually run about an hour. If you're talking old school live to air television that has commercials, you're already down to about 42 to 46 minutes. And a lot has to happen in that 46 minutes. You have to have the crime committed, have it get investigated, probably some kind of dramatic high-speed chase, and then some kind of conclusion. The same thing or something similar happens across most films. So time is definitely a factor which impacts the storytelling. How do we test this out? How did Schweitzer and Sachs do it? If you're going back to the article that you were asked to look at, page 361 outlines the methodology that they used in their experiment. It also includes the key statements that were included by the fake expert in the footnote. So you can take a look at the specific script that was used during their study. But essentially what they did was they simulated a criminal trial. So they gave a bunch of university students a transcript of a fake criminal trial, so a fake story that included testimony from a forensic science expert. So a testimony is when you have a witness at trial that speaks about something related to the case. Maybe it's a witness that happened to witness the crime. Maybe it is a forensic science expert who helped to collect evidence after the crime. But that's where this testimony comes from. It comes from a fake case. And so the testimony included a statement from this forensic scientist who did the testing of a hair that was found at the fake scene of the crime. And the forensic science expert said that the hair came from the defendant. The authors also explained who their population was. So it was 48 university students at the university that they were working in. And they go into detail about the questionnaire. So they spoke about the different variables that they measured and how they categorized TV viewing habits. So they had forensic science program viewing specific questions, so forensic science programs like CSI, as well as general crime themed programming, shows like Law and Order or The Flash, for example, that aren't necessarily about crime scene science, but have to do with the criminal justice system. You could categorize Law and Order in there also, which features some investigation, some police work, and some of the legal stuff that happens in the courtroom. The questionnaire included questions about the perception of the trial and the perceptions of the evidence that was presented, in addition to the questions related to the TV viewing habits of the 48 university students. So what did the authors in the 2006 study find? They found that CSI viewers, and keep in mind that this is all self-reported, and we see this come up again later in the 2020 article. When you're doing a survey or sometimes an interview as well, you're relying on your participants to understand what it is that you're talking about, and they are reporting you their perceptions on something. And we'll see this a little bit later when we look at the 2020 article, because they found if you're trying to measure like heavy versus light or moderate crime scene program viewing, if you don't define those very clearly, you might have a different definition of them. So I might say watching CSI once a week constitutes low viewing, but you guys might say watching it once a month constitutes low viewing, and watching it once a week is actually moderate viewing. So there could be some kind of issue there with self-reporting, and we're going to talk about that again in a little bit. So the first comparison that Schweitzer and Sachs did was between CSI viewers and viewers that did not watch CSI. They found that, and then the second one was between forensic science viewers, so CSI viewers, and crime drama viewers more broadly. They found that what they were looking at was the ability, how these participants felt that they understood the forensic science, generally speaking, and the forensic science that was present in the trial transcript they were asked to read. They also looked at how they viewed the evidence was presented at trial, so how they viewed the forensic scientist. And finally, at the end, they looked at the verdicts rendered. So whether the individual survey participant found that the person accused, the defendant, was guilty or not guilty. And how strongly they felt in terms of the confidence in their verdicts. Starting with CSI crime show viewers and non-viewers, what the authors found was that crime show viewers self-reported to be more confident in their understanding of the tasks of a forensic scientist. Apart from that, they found that this group was the same on all of the other metrics. So in terms of how crime show viewers and non-viewers compared, they found that they were the same, except for this ability to understand forensic science, in which case crime show viewers spoke more confidently. In contrast, let's just go back a slide here. In contrast, when the authors were comparing CSI viewers to non-viewers, they found that CSI viewers were much more confident in their understanding of how forensic science works than non-viewers. So again, a similarity between CSI and crime show viewers generally. CSI viewers were also more critical of the forensic science evidence that was presented at trial. So in general, after reading the trial transcript, CSI viewers rated the evidence presented, this hair, as less believable. There was also a difference in the verdicts that were rendered between CSI viewers and non-CSI viewers. So only 18% of people that watched CSI found the defendant guilty, whereas forensic science viewers, crime drama viewers and non-viewers of the genre found 29% of them found guilty verdicts. And finally, in terms of the confidence in their verdict, CSI viewers were more confident than viewers that did not watch CSI at all. So it does show, at least this preliminary study in 2006 shows that there is some criticism and skepticism towards forensic science evidence, depending on your exposure to it in popular culture. However, with that said, the authors found that there is an equal burden on prosecutors and defense. So they found that, yes, the CSI effect does seem to exist, but it doesn't seem to affect one side of the case more than the other. Rather, it affects both together. These findings were limited to CSI viewers. So while the legal world was a little bit worried about crime shows in general, Schweitzer and Sachs said that this effect seems to only take place amongst CSI viewers. They weren't sure, and this is one of the limitations of their research, about the impact. So it's not clear to what degree watching CSI influences how you feel about the evidence that was presented. And so that's an area that needs future study. Other limitations that they identified in their study was that there was no testing done on jury deliberations, and that when juries get together, so all of the people that are reaching this verdict, they talk amongst themselves, kind of like in a closed room, they deliberate. Being in a jury could either reduce or make these differences bigger. Their case was also limited, their study was also limited to just one case with one fact pattern or one story that looked at one type of forensic evidence. So they looked at this hair and DNA piece. It doesn't account for other types of evidence. And so they were like, this needs to be studied more because we're not sure what the impact is. We just know that there is one, but there only is one in this specific context. The other thing that the authors found is that their study doesn't account for the idea that the CSI effect could operate in reverse. So the way that they say the CSI effect operates now is if you watch CSI, you have greater trust in forensic science evidence. And if you have greater trust in forensic science evidence and there isn't any, that'll impact your verdict. And if there is some, that's going to impact your verdict. What the authors are saying is that the CSI effect might actually operate in the other direction, in the sense that if I, as a potential jury member or member of society, have really high hopes for forensic science, or I believe strongly in the criminal justice system, I might be drawn to watch shows like CSI. and then the circle still works, but it works in the other direction. And so this kind of comes back to a question that we asked a couple weeks ago or a couple classes ago, which is what comes first? Is it popular culture that comes first and influences our perceptions and ideas? Or do our ideas influence popular culture, which then reflects them back to us? And irrespective of which way you think that the circle operates, what's the impact of that? So that's something to keep in mind as we work through the course together. We're only in week 4, but it's a question to keep there as we work through other material. So that was the first study, the Schweitzer and Sachs study. The next study, the 2016 one, found that the CSI effect actually has a whole bunch of different elements. They defined the CSI effect a little bit differently than the 2006 study, but don't forget that that's because there was 10 years in between them. So there's been a lot of research since Schweitzer and Sachs did their paper by the time Chance and Salfati got around to it. Their definition said that the CSI effect refers to the effect of crime dramas, so not just CSI, on the general public's, and by extension, the jury pool's, perception of criminal justice and the criminal justice system. So it's not just about forensic science evidence, which is kind of what Schweitzer and Sachs was saying earlier. Rather, what these guys are interested in is focusing on the impact of CSI genre television on the expectations of forensic science and the decisions that jurors make regarding the verdict of a trial. They found that there were a lot of other aspects of crime dramas that include information relevant to the legal and trial system. So evidence collection is one piece. Evidence testing is another piece. How this evidence is presented at trial, what kind of investigative procedures are used, and what kind of crime-solving techniques are used in the programs and in the cases that are presented on screen. They also found in their literature review that after 10 years of study, there was lots of controversy over whether the CSI effect even existed, and that this effect varies, how you see this effect varies from depending on what discipline you come in. And so their review of the literature tried to resolve what existed. Like they tried to resolve this tension that they found in the literature. So they set up their problem by outlining some of the ways that the CSI effect had been studied. So as an example, they found that there was a lot of anecdotes, so personal stories, of cases that were thought to be impacted by the CSI effect. Existing research after 10 years had done surveys of jurors, lawyers, and law enforcement personnel. They also looked at jury simulations, so experiments like the Schweitzer and Sachs article. And there was studies out there that also looked at acquittal rates, so whether or not people were acquitted and what kind of evidence was presented there. They also identified different definitions of the CSI effect and explained where theirs came from. They found that in addition to this controversy that existed over whether the CSI effect existed, there was also controversy over the extent of the impact that CSI effect and CSI-like programs might have on individual jurors. And they tried to explain why it might have this kind of effect. So repetition is one potential piece. It happens on so many different television shows and in films, like we saw in the video that we watched a few minutes ago. Cultivation theory, so the idea that what you're seeing creates expectations. Cultivation theory, they said, with regards to television, states that TV shows and other media portray a social reality, and people who spend the most time watching a show will mimic or adopt that social reality as their own when they're faced with that situation. So in the context of the CSI effect, if you've never been asked to sit on a jury before, but you've seen lots of episodes of CSI and CSI-like programs, you'll learn about that reality through those programs. That's the cultivation theory. The other theory that the authors pointed to was the social cognitive theory. So they said that according to social cognitive theory, television is a source of social modeling, so behaviors. Essentially, we learn what reactions and behaviors are appropriate as well as expected from what we watch. Now, ultimately, they ended up relying on Cole and De Soso Vila's conception of the CSI effect. And that's what you see on the screen in front of you now. So they said that the CSI effect theory or hypothesis says that viewers of crime dramas develop positive but unrealistic expectations about the quality, availability, and accessibility of forensic evidence at a crime scene in real life. And this is what you see in the second circles. So the first box is potential jurors, so everyday people within a certain age, watch CSI-like programs. Because we watch CSI-like programs, we develop these assumptions. So the first is that forensic evidence or forensic science evidence, FE, can never be wrong or is rarely wrong. In other words, it's infallible. Second, forensic science evidence, or FE, is found at every crime scene and is tested and is used in all criminal cases. In some cases, there might not be FE, but we don't see that when we're watching CSI because it's a program that's structured around the collection of evidence. And the third expectation is that forensic evidence testing, collection is done very, very quickly. So step one, potential jurors watch CSI. Step two, we develop these three assumptions. The result of these three assumptions is that we now have increased, perhaps unrealistic, expectations for forensic science evidence, which means that if in a trial there is no forensic science evidence, this is hypothesis one, we should or will be likely to acquit the person that's on trial. The second hypothesis is because we have these high expectations where there is forensic science, we will be likely to convict. And so the authors highlighted a whole bunch of studies that show that most people believe in the CSI effect as presented on your screen. Some of the lawyers that were surveyed found that the CSI effect was a serious challenge to their job. Law enforcement officials, so like police officers, found that forensic science evidence and the CSI effect made it easier to do their job, that they could more easily justify the collection of evidence at crime scenes. And despite these personal anecdotes or surveys, the academic literature was split on whether the CSI effect existed. Some authors argued that it's a fabrication or a falsehood by prosecutors who are bitter when they lose at trial, that there has and always will be a general distrust in juries. Scholars from the legal and criminal justice fields who studied the CSI effect were more likely to say that the effect exists and that it undermines the legitimacy of the legal system. So how did Shantz and Solfati do their research project. So they did two things. The first thing that they did was a mixed methods review of the literature. And their methodology section is a really good example of a methodology section. They went into detail about what search terms they used for their systematic review of literature. They talked about the data that they searched and collected. So in addition to the key terms, they also explained how they narrowed down their results. They started with over 150,000 sources, but they only included articles that looked at the impact on participants in legal and criminal justice settings. So that means that they focused on mock or actual jurors, potential jurors, and trial type situations. In total, they explained that they had 63 articles between 2004 and 2013. They explained where those articles came from, and they indicated when they were published. And so you can see this in detail on page 66 of their article. So again, I would flag the methodology section, especially for the final project, with regards to the level of detail that's needed to explain what you did so that someone can test out your project later. They went on to explain their meta-analysis, and on page 69, they break down the specific characteristics of the studies that they used in their project. So they looked at sample, mock, or real, and outcome that was measured, explanations, or verdict. Their findings. So the first thing they looked at was the meta-analysis, so a quantitative look at juror expectations. They found that according to the previous studies that existed, watching crime dramas does have an impact on what jury members expect in a courtroom. So previous studies have shown that it affects how jurors behave, how they evaluate evidence, and how they use the evidence in a trial to determine guilt. In particular, 42% of the articles that they looked at claimed that the CSI effect caused jurors to acquit defendants when no forensic evidence was given at a trial. Breaking down the existing research as part of their meta-analysis, they found that law reviews, so scholarly journals in the legal world, have the highest level of discussion about the topic. But even then, it's split among the types of articles examined in terms of whether the CSI effect exists. So what they say is that there's more work to do, but there is an impact. So coming out of 10 years of research, from Schweitzer and Sachs to Shantz and Salvati, we can say that the CSI effect exists, but we don't really know what its impact is. So in other words, it exists, but should we be worried about it? Is it something to be concerned with? And that brings us to the 2020 article, although there were certainly other articles that have been written since then. So what the authors did, Clients, Winters, and Chapman did in their 2020 article was they started from the premise that prosecutors and defense lawyers are still really worried about the CSI effect. In particular, the CSI effect is starting to show up in jury selection. And so because prosecutors and defense lawyers are worried that if I'm a fan or a heavy user or viewer of crime scene related programming, that's going to impact how I feel about the evidence. Similarly, if I'm a low user of or low viewer of CSI programming, that's going to impact how I feel and understand the evidence. This is the real world concern. And so because lawyers are worried about this, when they're selecting their jury members, they're screening for it. So if you get called to do jury duty, there's usually like a lot of people in the room. And then I think most juries are made up of 12 people. And it's not the first 12 necessarily. It could be any 12 of those 30, or maybe there's more than 30 people. But when you're asked to be on a jury, you go to the courthouse, and one of the first steps is jury selection. So you get up there and you're asked a bunch of questions about whether or not you should be a jury member, whether you can be excused from the jury for valid reasons. And if you don't have a valid reason, you're expected to serve. But the lawyers can ask you questions and screen you out. And they have so many questions that they can ask, and so many people that they can say, look, we don't want you on our jury. But thinking about this in real terms, if I'm a defense attorney and I know what evidence is going to be presented at trial by the prosecution, and I know it's flashy, exciting, DNA-related evidence, just like you see on television, I would be worried, or I might be worried, that if I have a jury member that watches CSI, they're going to be likely to find my client guilty. And so I might start asking questions about this to someone on the stands. At the same time, a prosecutor could worry that because they don't have DNA evidence or flashy type evidence like you see on television, that I might acquit somebody. And so I would ask, are you a CSI viewer? And if you said yes, I might say, okay, we don't want you on our jury. So this is where it's coming up. It's coming up now in courtrooms before you even get to hear the evidence. And so this is how and why these authors examine the CSI effect. And I've left these slides intentionally blank for you. This is a really good way for you to start analyzing the articles that you're being asked to read in our class and the articles that you'll be reading for your annotated summaries. So try to break it up piece by piece. Here, we're talking about the introduction and the definitions or hypothesis that is being presented. So there would be a definition for the CSI effect. And then after that, you see on the first page of the article, they explain the kind of why does this matter? So it matters because prosecutors are worried that jurors will require forensic evidence in order to convict a defendant. At the same time, defense attorneys are worried that jurors will believe that forensic evidence is like perfect, which means that if there is forensic evidence, it's going to have a greater impact on guilty judgments coming from CSI viewers. So that's the first thing that they talk about in their very brief introduction. From there, they move on to their literature review section, which you'll notice they don't actually call a literature review. But what they look at is the CSI effect generally, and they break it down into 4 different themes. Now, for your annotated summaries, think about the themes. For your literature review, present it in themes. And so when you're working on your annotated summaries, think about having at least 1 sentence for every section. What did they say in their introduction? What did they say in their literature review? What themes did they identify? What concepts did they use? What did they find really based on existing literature? And that matters because when you get to your results and discussion section, which we'll see in just a moment, you need to tie in your project. And the authors here do that as well. But you tie in your project with existing research to show what your project brings once you've conducted it that hasn't been done before. So the first theme that Clance looks at with his co-authors is surveys of attorneys and judges. And so you'll notice in this literature review section, the authors actually use 3 themes to talk about the CSI effect. And how they organize it is based on methodology. So what they found most interesting or most relevant for their work was to organize it by method. So the first way that the CSI effect has been studied is by doing surveys of lawyers or attorneys and judges. And they found that there's a lot of anecdotal evidence there. So they talk about the Robbers article, which showed that prosecutors, defense attorneys, and judges felt, so they gave their opinion in a survey, that watching television, in particular CSI, and CSI-like programs influenced a jury decision. They also looked at a real-life study. So Maricopa County is a real-life study that was conducted, not necessarily academic per se, but they also found that lawyers felt that they either won or lost the case based on the forensic evidence that was presented at trial. And these lawyers felt that juries learned about evidence from television. So you'll notice that those are some of the readings that they refer to in the first theme. The second theme, or the second way that the CSI effect has been studied, it's by surveying jury eligible citizens. So there's this whole block of research that looks at professionals that work in this area. And then there's a whole block of research that looked at everyday people who could be on a jury. And so they talk about the different studies that exist there. And they found, and they broke it down, right? So they talked about which types of crime had the most or least CSI effect, which types of evidence had the most types or least CSI effect. And that's what the surveys showed. The final of the first 3 themes looked at experiments, so jury simulation studies. And they found that of the majority of jury simulation studies that are out there, there was no support to show that watching CSI and CSI-like programming had a relationship with guilty verdicts. And they talk about Schweitzer and Sachs in there, and the types of research that's been done. And while there might be a connection, like Schweitzer and Sachs saw, between watching CSI and CSI-like programs and my feeling towards understanding forensic science evidence, that didn't necessarily impact the verdict or outcome of the case. So they present some that say, yeah, the impact's not super clear. And then they talk about 2 final jury simulation studies that do show support for the CSI effect. One of them actually used the same case or story that Schweitzer and Sachs included. And it found that when crime drama viewers identified with the characters in the crime drama, there were higher ratings of verdict confidence than infrequent viewers. So there was some indirect support to show that a CSI effect existed. And now we come to the 4th theme that was talked about in the literature review section, which relates to jury deliberations. So again, a jury deliberation is after all of the evidence is presented at trial. The jury gets together in a room and they talk about the evidence presented and whether or not the person should be convicted, and they debate why. And there had been a lack of research in this area. So the authors first note that many previous researchers are like, hey, jury deliberations need to be studied. And then they talk about the handful of studies that have looked at this, but explain some of the limitations to these studies. So in particular, there was no analysis of the content of the deliberations that took place. And this leads to the study that Clance and his authors and his co-authors wanted to look at in 2020. So they said that there was a variety of mixed results that showed very limited support for a CSI effect. And because of the mixed results, it was important to do extra research that looked at the relationship between watching CSI and CSI-like programming and guilty judgments. So what they chose to do in their study, in the study that you were asked to look at for this class, was to think about and determine whether the level of viewing of forensic crime dramas was related to decision making in a case involving DNA evidence. And they focused on DNA evidence because that kind of evidence appears in 84% of CSI episodes. So what you see in this sentence here, which you can find under the present study section, is the authors have justified or explained why they chose to emphasize not only their choice of doing jury deliberations, but their choice of focusing on DNA evidence in particular. And that's a key aspect of methodology, is justifying why you're doing something. So they wanted to look at deliberations because there hadn't been a lot of work on that yet. And what they were interested in looking at was whether a person's comments related to DNA evidence, what evidence was missing from the case. So if I was talking about the case and was like, hey, there's no DNA evidence. And they also wanted to analyze the relationship between that person's level of crime viewing and these comments that they made. And you'll notice that they made a lot of different hypotheses. So they actually make more than you guys need to make for the purpose of this class, but they made hypotheses related to the extent of guilt and verdicts. So they created guilty conditions, innocent conditions. They made hypotheses from the perspective of defense attorneys and prosecutors. They looked at verdict influences and made a hypothesis based on that. They made hypotheses related to the deliberation discussions that were to take place in the rooms. So they made a lot of different hypotheses. And you'll notice when you get to the results and discussion sections, they talk about whether or not these hypotheses were confirmed or refuted. So whether they were proved or disproved. Now, an important section of this paper is the methodology section. So it's in the proposal, when you're writing your methodology, you're thinking about what will we do? And that can be quite challenging because you're trying to think about how many people are we going to recruit, for example, how many movies are we going to watch? How are we going to code them? So your methodology should be as detailed as possible in both the proposal and the final project. There's a language difference. The proposal is we will be doing this, or we propose to do this, whereas the final project is very past tense. We did do this. We consulted this many people. We watched this many movies. And you can see that level of detail also coming across in the way that they structured their methods section. So I would encourage you and flag for you the use of titles and subtitles here to help really separate those sections. In their methodology section, they talk about who the participants were in their study. So they were undergrad students in a college in the US. They were recruited, they kind of had to, because they had to take part in this experiment or in this study to fulfill a course requirement. They break down the gender of the participants as well as the age of the participants. They talk about how the juries were structured. So 13 juries of 12 and 2 of 11, and they explain why. They also explain how each of the deliberations was run very briefly in the method section. So using individual microphones or a centralized microphone to capture the discussions. Then they get into the materials. So they talk about these evidence conditions. Essentially what that is a story. There was a DNA guilty story a DNA innocent story, and a no DNA story. So depending on which story you got as a participant, you had a different scenario that was presented. They talk more about the transcript or the materials. So participants were asked to read a transcript. They go into how long it was. They talk about what was part of it. So opening and closing statements and the direct and cross-examination of witnesses. And they also talk about other material that the participants in this study were given. So they were given a witness list. They were given a list of exhibits related to the case. They were also given a piece of paper that explained what the charge was and the 3 propositions that the state or the prosecutors had to prove to find the defendant guilty. And then the authors go into more detail talking about the different DNA situations that were there. So you can go back to the article and take a look at that, but they provide quite a bit of detail in terms of how they came up with these stories, what the stories included, and why they were there. So that was one piece of their study. The second piece of their study was a jury selection questionnaire, so a survey. And they include a variety of questions in their survey, and we're given a snapshot of those. So they were given demographic questions, so they could run statistics based on demographics, and we'll see that in the results section. In the same questionnaire, they were also given questions that simulated questions that would be asked during a real jury selection. And they were asked questions about their viewing habits related to 10 television programs in the crime scene drama genre. They also emphasize that other programs were asked too, and that's because they didn't want the participants to notice that it was only forensic themed. So they included Cops, Judge Judy, Prison Break. There's a theme there too. They included questions about other law-related television programs, but we see very clearly which CSI type programs they were interested in their study. And then they were given another questionnaire where participants were asked to indicate whether or not the defendant was guilty or not guilty, and then the extent of the guilt on a scale of 1 to 10. So they were asked very specific questions also about the trial evidence that they were given. And then this section further goes into detail about the procedure that they were given, so how long they were given to read the transcripts, how long they were given to deliberate. So you'll see that that is provided in detail also, and this helps with the replicability of the study. If we wanted to, as part of this class, we could test this out and see if we get the same results as these authors found. Finally, they explain their coding system. So they explain how the different categories were developed, what types of words that were included, how they knew when to classify something, different comments that were made, and also how they sought to test out intercoder reliability. And so that's something that we can talk about if you're interested in doing some kind of coding. And Cassidy spoke about coder reliability and coding also in the video in our live class on Wednesday with regards to proposals. Now, you'll notice that the findings of their study are presented in 2 sections. The first section is very statistical based under results, and they break down their findings by hypotheses that they were given. So this is a really great way to structure your results section. If you have more than one research question or hypotheses, you can structure your results that way and structure your discussion section in a similar way. Alternatively, you could present themes that emerge in your research. The authors do this too. Their themes are their hypotheses, essentially. So extent of guilt and verdict, for example, is 3 of their hypotheses. But it's easy as a reader for us to go back and say, oh, what did they say about this? And why did they pick this hypothesis? And you'll notice that they don't just include numbers. Yes, it includes a lot of numbers, but they've condensed their statistics into tables and into charts. And I would encourage you to do something similar for your project. When you present the results section, we don't need to see all of the stats. We need to see a summary of the stats. We need to get an understanding of why they're important. And then that connects to the discussion section. So the authors did that using different headings. And in their discussion section, that's where the authors tie in their research project with existing research or literature. So for example, under the extent of guilt ratings and verdicts section, they found in their study that when DNA evidence indicating guilt was presented, CSI viewing level was not related to either of the guilt judgments, and therefore their first hypothesis is not supported. This means that incriminating DNA evidence doesn't convince everyone, but is equally compelling regardless of whether or not you watch CSI. And then they talk about that a little bit more. And then later they say, Divine, Budham, Hoop, Studebaker, and Stoll all found that the strength of a prosecutor's evidence related to a specific charge and was a significant predictor of jury verdicts. And so here they're talking about how their study relates to existing studies. So the strength of the evidence in the case that Clentz conducted might overwhelm individual juror biases. And this could be because DNA evidence is now in many media sources, not just forensic crime drama. So it's difficult to tell when you're talking about viewing level where we get that information from. So that's one example of how they connect their results to existing discussion. They also talk about verdict influence. They use the same headings as in previous sections. This is very helpful as a reader. And you'll notice in the final section under jury's deliberation discussion, they save this for last. It's also what their study kind of contributed. It filled a gap, but they emphasize that this is the most significant contribution of their study. The fact that they did include jury deliberations, because it allowed them to explore the comments that were made based on the participants, based on their viewing level. And so they talk about why this is important and what the findings are. And they say, you know, this finding might help to reduce concerns that if I do watch CSI, I'm going to take that knowledge into the jury deliberation room and contaminate other jurors. So they tie this in with other studies talking about how it's consistent with it. And then they go in and move on to the limitations section of their study. So they explain some of the limitations, but try to justify them also. So they talk about, as I was mentioning a few minutes ago, how participants might have a different interpretation of what occasional versus regular viewing is. But if we're a lawyer in a courtroom asking potential jury members the same question, that interpretation issue is going to arise there too. So they're like, yes, this is a limit of our study, but it's also a limit that exists in reality. So maybe that limit isn't as big of a deal as it seems originally. And then the last thing they do is they conclude. So they found that consistent with a CSI effect, high viewers, when compared to moderate and low viewers, expressed a lower extent of guilt ratings in DNA innocent and DNA control conditions. But this pattern was not reflected in verdicts. So just because I might hold that belief as an individual juror doesn't mean it's going to come across into guilty verdicts. And they conclude that while media portrayals of the CSI effect show that it exists, and frequent portrayals make it appear that a CSI effect has been established, acting too soon to try to counteract this CSI effect by screening in and out jurors based on their viewing habits is premature. So that's where the CSI effect ends up. About 15, 16 years since the first study that we looked at was conducted, but also over 20 years since CSI has been around. But it brings up an important question. Why does studying the CSI effect matter? It matters because it affects people in real life. So while it seems that the CSI effect might not be as worrisome as we first thought, and it might not be as worrisome as lawyers are concerned that it is, if it does exist, and we're still trying to get a good understanding of what the impact of it is, it affects real people. So if CSI programs create this, this need for forensic science evidence, and there is or isn't evidence presented at trial, and that determines the outcome of trial, so whether you're found guilty or innocent, ultimately that could determine whether you go to jail, whether you spend the rest of your life in jail or whether you spend it free. And even if it doesn't impact the verdicts necessarily, it might impact how lawyers behave. So it might impact what evidence they decide to put forward, what evidence they choose to emphasize. It might impact witness testimony in terms of how lawyers prepare witnesses and those kinds of things. And all of this has the potential to affect the outcome. So that's really why it matters in this situation, and why it's important to think about the impact of television shows like CSI. And if we believe, or at least feel, that the CSI effect is a possibility, it also begs the question, how do other programs impact how we our expectations and behaviors? How do programs involving doctors impact our interactions with doctors? How do those programs impact how doctors interact with patients? How do they impact our expectations when we go to the hospital? You know, if we see people get rushed into an emergency room and get treated instantly when we show up at the emergency room, is that the kind of treatment that we expect? So these are questions to think about. It might also influence the kind of treatment that we expect from lawyers, or the behavior that we expect from lawyers or the military. It might influence our career choice and our relationships and our expectations outside of employment, but in everyday life. Now, with that said, as the Pop Justice article demonstrated, popular culture can also inspire us. So if we watch a film or read a book that features a certain profession or a certain type of person, we may be inspired to emulate or mimic them. It could influence our career choice. It could influence many other decisions that we make in our everyday life. And the CSI effect is just one example of the ways in which that influence operates. So that's it for the substantive material. Just kind of recapping on the midterm and final exam, all of the groups should have received an email from me already. I've also emailed all partial groups and any students that don't have a group. If you haven't replied to that, I would kindly ask that someone from your group does, just so that we can touch base. We don't need to meet right away, although I am certainly available. But I just want to make sure that you've been able to reach your group members and that you guys have started talking about your project, because it will be due after reading week. If you're struggling with topics, you can start with the syllabus as an example of the different areas, or hopefully Cassidy's presentation gave you some ideas about how her topic came about, and perhaps how your topic can grow from the initial interest or idea that you had into something that's researchable for the purpose of this class. And then I also gave a tutorial on Wednesday about how to use the library. So if this is something that you've never done before, it's not a problem. Please go back and watch that part of the video. And if you have any questions as you're trying to navigate the library, or if there's an article that you would like that you've stumbled across but you can't find it, let me know and I will do my best to try to grab that for you. In terms of what's coming next, so your quiz 2 is going to be due on Tuesday, February 8th at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, so same time as per usual. It's live now. It was live on Wednesday at 10 p.m. If you have any difficulty accessing the quiz, please let me know. Your grades as well as the answers from quiz 1 are also available. Your next journal entry is going to be due on February 9th as per usual. And then in terms of next week, so Wednesday, February 10th is our last class before reading week. Regular time, 7 p.m. I'm happy to stay online after class though. In case anyone wants to talk about the research projects, we can hop into a breakout room. And there's no asynchronous class next week. So we do not have a recorded video. I would instead encourage you to use the time to meet with your group at least once before reading week, or use that time to schedule some time with me to chat about your project or with Cassidy or Erica. So with that said, thank you very much for tuning in and we'll see you on Wednesday, February 10th, if not before.